All right, everyone. We are officially recording. For those that need to let their lawyers know that you're being recorded, this is it. You're being officially recorded. Welcome to our part 2 of our end-of-life discussions with part of our Nash and Know program. I want to thank Carol for being the thorn in my side to remind me that we need to do some more Nash and Know. That's not, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Carol said, how can I help you this summer? And I said, if you could take the reins of Nash and Know, that would be so helpful. And so these two great programs came out of this opportunity. And I just want to thank her. And I want to thank our speakers who represent, as I was just mentioning before, a founding family, one of the oldest families in the congregation, and Dr. Paul Stander, with literally our newest member of the congregation on the same call, Allison Kierman. Carol will make a little more formal introduction, but Paul, thank you for being here. Allison, thank you for being here. And I'm gonna hand it off to Carol to make the formal introductions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, for putting this, allowing this to happen and helping to put it together. The biography of each of these people is fairly impressive. So I'm going to go through it pretty fast because maybe you've already read it online. Dr. Stander is a graduate of Cornell University and also Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. Go Philadelphia. He did his residency training at the Medical College of Wisconsin and has an MBA from the University of Phoenix. He's board certified in internal medicine, geriatric medicine, and hospice and palliative medicine, and is currently Associate Chief of Staff for Geriatrics and Extended Care at the Phoenix Veteran Affairs Health System. He's also Clinical Professor of Medicine at the University of Arizona College of Medicine and Associate Director of the University of Arizona Phoenix Geriatrics Fellowship Program, and a member of the National VA Medical Advisory Panel for Pharmacy Services. He is focusing his efforts at this point in his career on the practice, teaching, and administration of geriatric medicine, palliative medicine, and hospice and clinical bioethics, with a particular interest in promoting improved methods for communication in patients with serious and life-limiting illness. And there will be an exam at the end of this for anybody who can repeat anything that I just said. Allison, I'm going to wait to give your introduction till you start to speak so it's more contemporaneous. And we've asked each of the speakers to talk for about a half an hour, and then we've left a half an hour for questions at the end. If you have questions, please send them into the chat box. What Dr. Stander said is if he sees something in the middle of his presentation, somebody looking for clarification or a question about something he said, if it doesn't detour too badly, then he will also answer the question. Both Paul and Allison have PowerPoints for us. So Dr. Stander, when you start and you're ready for us to put up the PowerPoints, Jeffrey Zonas, my technical advisor, and sometimes sleeping partner, will take over the technical piece of this program.
Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead and post the PowerPoints. And I'm happy to be here tonight. You know, this PowerPoint that I'm using, a lot of it comes out of a program. You know, as Carol was explaining, I worked for Banner for 26 years, and then I transitioned over to the VA in about 2014. And at that time, can you put it into slideshow or might project a little better? No, up top there where it says slideshow.
Oh.
Up top.
Slide
All the way. Keep going up. Go up
Yeah.
over there where that, yeah, hit that. And then just
Like play from
Play.
start
play from start over here.
on the far left.
over here.
Yeah. Okay. So when I went to the VA, one of my charges was overseeing the geriatric fellowship. We also have a hospice and palliative care fellowship. So I took this program on how to teach communication and serious illness that was run out of Harvard at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and also by a guy named Atul Gawande, who has a quality improvement program. I don't know how many of you have heard of Atul Gawande, but he's written the book Being Mortal, and he's a surgeon at Brigham and Women's. So a lot of this PowerPoint is what I've been doing is actually trying to teach this to my fellows, the people who are becoming geriatricians and palliative care doctors, and also the internal medicine residents and students who rotate through, but also to physicians out in the community to the extent that we can, because sadly, as I will explain a little bit, most docs aren't really either very skilled at doing this or all that interested in doing this. And we don't get a lot of training in, it's changing a little, but you don't get a lot of training in how to talk about bad things or end of life or, those kinds of things in medical school or in your residency. Okay, next slide. So my objectives, you got the next slide?
Yeah, got it.
Is, I just want to try and talk about, the population of patients for whom these discussions really hold the most benefits. I think they're feasible for everybody, but in general, it has a more pressing issue for people who have serious or life-limiting illness or who are, obviously a little bit up in years that it's more likely to be facing these decisions sooner rather than later. And then how to improve communication in both directions for patients with serious illness. And then I'll talk a little bit about, we won't go into too much detail, because what I do with the doctors is show them a real structured communication tool about how to actually have these conversations, sort of language to use and language not to use, and how to respond to people who, when you deliver bad news or things that they don't want to hear. Okay, next slide. So one of the principles of geriatrics that I want to make sure we, understand is that age is just a number, and we don't really, focus necessarily on chronological age alone. The notion, I don't know if any of you are aware of where this age 65 defining elderly, but it goes way back, believe it or not, to the era of Bismarck in Germany, who was the first one who sort of set up a pension retirement plan. And he picked age 65, which is, at the time, there weren't very many. And so he didn't think he would have to pay a whole lot. And it's not that far off from how we defined 65 for Medicare and Social Security in this country, because back in the day when those things were implemented, certainly Social Security back in the New Deal era, life expectancy was barely above that. And even Medicare, when that came into being 65, life expectancy wasn't much greater. So, we really focus, on the fact that your age is really a chronological age number versus a functional age. I mean, I could tell you there's a 79-year-old person with a history of pancreatic cancer, diabetes, and heart failure, and that person could be in a nursing home on hospice or could be on the Supreme Court. So those are, you have to really look at more than just the age. Now, at the same time, there are a lot of physiologic changes that occur with aging. Even people say, I feel fine, or, oh, he was completely normal. I mean, I get this a lot when somebody has a bad event or gets a pneumonia or something and they're pretty debilitated, and they say, well, he was perfectly healthy, a month ago. Well, what's the real reality in people as they get older is they may be doing fine when there's no real stress or acute medical illness, but there's a loss of reserve capacity that, they may be hovering on normal, but and getting by, but any added insult can really tip them over the edge. Because you lose muscle and bone mass as you get older, which makes you prone to falls and fractures. There's an increased percent of body fat compared to muscle mass, which has a lot of impacts on drug metabolism. Your renal function generally declines. You're more prone to getting dehydrated. You don't handle medications as well. And then there can be cognitive changes. There is some minor, there's really loss of memory is not necessarily a normal feature of aging, but obviously cognitive decline is more common in the elderly. And those people who have underlying dementia are prone to complications like delirium, which is an acute confusional state superimposed on that when they get hospitalized. So these are some of the things that we just need to be aware of among the geriatric population, even if they seem kind of perfectly fine, quote unquote, when all things are equal. Next. So it predisposes the geriatric population to lots of problems. Oftentimes they're on too many medications that can have adverse reactions and drug interactions. And hospitals are like the last place that we want the geriatric population. They're much more prone to lots of complications like delirium, which is an acute confusional state, particularly in the ICU. They can get infections from aspirating, which is inhaling what things you should normally swallow, urinary tract infections, more prone to skin breakdown and what are called commonly referred to as bed sores. Lying in bed, the more is not good for elderly. It contributes to further loss of muscle function, prone to blood clots. Procedures where you have to use dye, can damage the kidneys. And so the hospitals are not good places for the elderly. So we try to focus as much as possible as keeping people out of the hospital and limiting procedures to the greatest degree possible and always weighing the risk versus the benefits. Okay, next. So I don't want you to be holding your breath, expecting your doctor to bring most of these discussions up with you. It's not really in their interest in many instances. In fact, sometimes they have an interest in doing more procedures and doing things. I'm not saying that they're necessarily, most doctors are, doing a lot of unnecessary things, but when the balance is should we or shouldn't we, they're going to get paid if they do something and not get paid if they don't. And talking about, what your wishes are can get reimbursed, but not all that well. Most doctors aren't comfortable with it. So a lot of what you see there's no easy way I can tell you this, so I'm sending you to someone who can, which is partly where the whole role of hospice, palliative care, geriatrics, we get a lot of referrals to, hey, will you talk about this to them? What's their prognosis? Should they be on hospice? Should they be this, that, or the other? Should they have this operation? So you're gonna likely be the one to bring this up if you wanna have these discussions rather than your doctor. Okay, next. So why should we have these conversations and why don't we in general? Okay, next. Well, first of all, most people actually do want to know the truth, want honest answers, the truth about their prognosis or what's going on. But, a lot of doctors feel like if they tell people things that are maybe not as optimistic, they're going to, patients are going to be upset, they're going to be harmed, they're going to take away, quote unquote, take away all their hope. So it's not, it's not a comfortable discussion that a lot of doctors want to have, or even patients sometimes. But it's not going to harm anybody to know the truth. It's anxiety provoking. That's one of the things we're trying to do, is design it in a way that it's less anxiety provoking for both patients and physicians. Doctors assume that everybody feels like living as long as possible is, what everybody wants, but that may not be the case, particularly as you get closer. And we'll show you some lists of other things that people, often prioritize upon over just living as long as possible. And often if people want to have some control as to what's going to happen to them as they get older, as they approach maybe an end of life scenario or a serious illness, and giving patients the opportunities to really openly express these wishes, their fears, their worries can be therapeutic. Next. There have been studies on this. I mean, this is just one of many where it just said that when you have frequent associated family meetings in the ICU, the quality of care is improved, the outcomes are better, they're in the hospital a few less, and there's less grief among the family who has to often make these decisions for people who can't speak for themselves. Next. Unfortunately, this happens, the good process isn't happening as much as we would like it. And we're in a situation in this country now where the vast majority of all the spending that goes on healthcare in this country is for the chronically ill. And it's disproportionate. The 20/80 rule, or what we call it, is it's actually 20% of the patients account for 80% of all the spending, and 10% account for about 2/3. Often these people have multiple chronic conditions. We're well aware that a lot of the Medicare dollars are spent in the last 6 months of life. People are ending up in the hospital and the emergency department in the last 6 months of life. And despite all this high spending, we don't really get better outcomes. In fact, our longevity is actually worse than many countries around the world. And it's safe to say that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with our healthcare system, particularly, in the elderly, for patients, families, and providers. Next. So we want to try to avoid that to the greatest degree possible, and having some of these conversations can really be helpful. So who are we really talking about? Are we focusing on having these conversations? Next. Well, in particular, and it probably doesn't apply to any of the people on this call right now, but we focus on people with advanced organ failure, whether it's heart failure, chronic lung disease like emphysema, chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, often a manifestation of diabetes, and then heart disease, that stands for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, so coronary disease, people who've had strokes, people who had some kind of peripheral artery disease, people with advanced cancer, stage 3 or 4, usually it means metastatic cancer of some kind. Increasing proportion is among patients with dementia or other neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease. And then anybody with 2 or more chronic conditions. And, again, that's the population that I deal with. So whatever age they're at, their functional status is poor. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all elderly. And most of you here who are on this call, again, probably this doesn't apply to, and hopefully it never will, or it won't for a while, but these are the priorities. Okay, next. And in case you hadn't noticed, there's a lot of people like that in this country. And I'm part of this baby boomer generation, anybody born between 46 and 64. And you can see the numbers there are pretty substantial. The population in the United States, about 330 million, 25, 30. So we're getting, about 20 to 25% of the population. And back in the day when Medicare and Social Security were first started, and those are all paid, those programs are paid for out of payroll, taxes, and people who are working. There were like 10 or more workers for each beneficiary. The number is down to 2 to 3 and is decreasing as the percentage of the elderly goes up, and our employment rate doesn't meet with that. So there's some financial imperative here as well, to try to, as a society, figure out how we can spend the dollars that we have most effectively and not waste them. Next. So when do we have these conversations? Okay, next slide. Well, first and foremost, I would say it's important at any stage of your life. at a minimum, and Allison's going to talk a lot about this, appointing somebody to speak on your behalf and looking at the different reasons. I'm going to defer to that. But so, in most people in our country, as I said, the main causes of death now are chronic illness. Back in the early 20th century, trauma, infection were the leading causes of death. Now, nobody dies from that virtually. COVID aside, pandemics are a different matter. But, the main causes of death now are chronic heart, lung, degenerative diseases, and cancer. So, for a phase 1, when you're healthy and you have relatively reversible illnesses, these conversations are not as urgent, but certainly appointing people to speak on your behalf, because anything can happen at any time in terms of an accident and so forth. That's important. In phase 2, we talk about as in people with chronic illnesses, or as they get older and are more vulnerable to that, it becomes a little more pressing. And then phase 3 is sort of these people who really are actively declining, have impaired functional status, and have a medical condition we refer to as frailty, which can be medically defined. Okay, next slide. So that's the group that's in this phase 3. These are the people who we focus on, who have an increasing burden of disease, whatever multiple organ illnesses or advanced cancer or dementia. These are the ones, as I've been saying, interventions don't go well. Frailty, I'll define that in a minute. And the treatments they're receiving are not really as effective previously. Their functional status is declining, and people are aware of this. That a lot of times doctors feel like, oh, they're going to tell them something they don't know. No, they're aware that they're not doing as well as they used to. They don't necessarily correlate that to mean that their life expectancy may be declining. And doctors aren't really good at prognosticating, as we'll see in a minute. Next.
And Paul, you have about 12 minutes.
Okay. So this is sort of the stages that I was talking about. So in these earlier stages, we're working on, it's more important to do chronic and reversible curative care. As you get into this phase 3 or 4, that's when we start talking and focusing more about comfort, symptom management. And then obviously near the very end, when it's 6 months or less, it's where hospice might kick in. Okay, next. So a minute about prognostication. Doctor, how much time do I have left? Or what do you mean? Next slide. The reality is it's very difficult to prognosticate until even really people are kind of close to the end. We have all kinds of biometric models that measure heart function and pulmonary function, liver function, and that's helpful. But we combine that with functional status, and you can come up with rough prognostications. The more you do, the better. The more facts and information you use, the better. But the reality is we tend to overemphasize these biometric models and de-emphasize the functional measures. Next slide. So these are the things that are actually as valuable in terms of prognostication, and this is what frailty is defined as: losing strength, muscle strength, and overall strength, unintended weight loss, less activity, increased sleeping, poor endurance, and slowed gait and unsteady gait. There's a test called the Get Up and Go test. You ask people to just stand up from a chair, ideally without using their arms, walking across a room of about 15 feet and back. And you time that, it's very well correlated to actual survival. It's something we can do in an office setting. It's very simple. It's often as valuable as some of the other more sophisticated tests we do. Okay, next. So, one of the things that it's important to just sort of understand is the different patterns of people who, before they die. Now this top left is sudden death. Somebody has a massive heart attack or an arrhythmia and quote unquote drops dead. that's becoming less and less common. The one on the top right is more of like a cancer diagnosis, where that line up top, it's a slow downward trend, and then they sort of fall off the cliff. The organ failure in the bottom left is very typical of heart failure, chronic lung disease, where there's a lot of remissions and exacerbations that people go in and out of the hospital. They're sort of on a slow decline, and they can look like they're on the brink of dying at one of the bottom of these exacerbations, but we can, in the hospital, make them better, but they never get quite back to where they were. So it's kind of a general, zigzag kind of decline. And then there's this frailty, which is sort of a piddly, slow decline, unpredictable, which is becoming kind of the more common, feature. And it's just really hard to know what the slopes of these lines and the time frame necessarily is on all these things. Okay, next. So what do we try to ask people, and what's important for you to tell both your doctors and make sure whoever your person who might speak for you on your behalf needs to know what your wishes are, because there's no right or wrong decision to be made about what you do or don't want. If you get seriously ill or as you're approaching, there's no right or wrong thing. And I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't, but it should be what you want. And ultimately, whoever is going to speak on your behalf should know what it is you want. So next. So first and foremost, though, as a physician, the facts should be out there that, okay, you have heart failure. We can't cure that. It's a chronic disease. It's going to get worse. We can control it. We can keep you, our goal should be to try and make it as few as functional as possible. But it's got to get out there that we don't have a magic cure for whatever the condition is. And once people know that, it's like, okay, well, knowing that, what are your values, your goals, and how much does your family know? Next. Now, as I said, sometimes when people are told this, it's like, the first answer is, well, keep me alive as long as possible, no matter what. That's rarely what I hear. What I hear is, well, I'd like to remain as independent as possible for as long as possible. I want to stay at home. I don't want to go in a nursing home. I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to be a burden to my family. And there's a whole other things. And living as long as possible, often, especially as people's functional status has declined, is not necessarily their highest priority, even if doctors just sometimes without asking assume that's what it is and are going to quote unquote do as much as they can or everything to keep them going as long as possible. Next slide. So how do we have this conversation and how do we talk about this? Next. Well, this is what I try and tell doctors. Be direct, be honest. Many times there have been studies, and it's sad to admit, but doctors consciously will tell people things that they know are wrong, will overestimate their prognosis because they don't want to upset them or take away quote unquote hope. I think that's an incredible disservice, and I'm not saying you have 3 weeks, you need, because we don't know, but we need to be honest in terms of a range of prognosis. So I'll tell people, I think, I can't say for certain, but it's probably more likely months rather than years or something in that kind of a thing. Plain language, don't use medical jargon. Ask them about knowing that how do they define quality of life? What are their fears and concerns? Acknowledge emotions. When somebody responds emotionally, the first thing doctors often do is respond with more facts instead of acknowledging their emotion and empathizing. And we've really focused on teaching residents and students what that means. And I don't have time to go into the details. Sometime if we wanted to, we could. Don't fear silence. A lot of times, I'll tell a person, give them something that maybe is a bad message or sad news. And rather than talking more, I just stop and let the silence linger and let the patient respond, as opposed to most of the time doctors talk too much. Once you've laid things out and explored all this come up with a specific recommendation, and don't do what more often than not, unfortunately, doctors do is talk more than half the time, use a lot of jargon that patients are embarrassed or don't admit that they don't understand, fear silence and talk too much, give overly optimistic prognoses, provide facts in response to strong emotions, and focus on medical procedures and things instead of kind of what are your overall wishes and goals. Next.
And Paul, you have about 3 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm to the very end. So one of the things that we tell people to do is don't ask the question, do you want us to do everything? I mean, I don't know what that means. And a patient's going to say, well, of course I want you to do everything. But it usually means all kinds of medical intervention. So it's a really bad question. People truly don't understand most people don't what's involved in resuscitation efforts. They see a lot of things on TV where the heroes whisk in and perform this, and miraculously people, are saved and everybody walks out of the room. When in fact, it can be a pretty gory, gruesome procedure, especially among frail elderly people. And then they're, left on a ventilator in an ICU, which isn't an ideal setting. So whatever procedure or question you're asked, or when you're weighing things, you really need to try to pin doctors down to, what do you think the benefit of this? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? How many side effects, adverse events? And, they may survive this, but am I going to be able to do X, Y, or Z that I want to do? Or am I going to be in a nursing home? Or am I going to be able to live at home? So you shouldn't hesitate to be aggressive in asking physicians to be explicit in when you're weighing these kinds of decisions. That may be my last one. I don't know. Is there another? So, in summary, I think advanced care planning, is important for everybody at any stage of their life. For those worst case scenarios, unexpected things, it's increasingly important as we get older, as if you do have any serious underlying chronic illnesses or frailty. There's no right or wrong or one size fits all. It should be personal and individualized, but make sure it's what you really want and not be pressured by family or your doctor or anybody else. And make sure that you are clear that your medical power of attorney knows what that is, because ultimately, if they have to make the calls, it should be what you want, not what they want or not what they think you want. And as I said, there's no one size fits all. So but it's important that it be, personal and individualized. So I'll be happy to take some questions later after. Is that what we want to do? Let Allison go. And yeah,
Thank you,
great.
Dr. Stander. Allison, you're up, and let me tell you a little bit about Allison. Allison Kierman, as Rabbi said, is the newest member of Temple Kolami. She's the owner and manager of her own law firm called Kierman Law, which is based in Scottsdale, and her focus is on wills, trusts, estate planning, asset protection, business succession planning, and probate. She's a contributing writer for the Jewish News. She's a member of the board of the National Council for Jewish Women of Arizona, a member of the youth board of the Martin Pear JCC, and is an alum of the Women's Leadership Institute of the Jewish Women's Learning Center. And we can provide her email address if anybody wants to follow up with her after her presentation. So Allison, you're on.
I want to interject. I want
And
to use the
everybody,
rabbinic.
please remember, if you've got questions, post them in the chat room so that we can see them as we go. Rabbi,
I want to interject. I unfortunately I can't be Dr. Stander's patient yet for a few more years, but I am a client of Allison Kierman and a fellow. Most importantly, she is from the great country of Texas, and that's something that we have that in common as well. But Allison, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. Excellent presentation. I really learned a lot, and that's helpful. So as Carol said, I do estate planning, and what that means in real terms is I help people get organized in their life. And some of it is getting organized for yourself, right? What Paul talked about, which is taking care of your financial and medical directives. And others is getting organized for your family after. You know, who will take care of you? How do you want to be taken care of? And what will happen to your things after you're gone? So we're going to talk about some of that today. One of my favorite stories is about William Shakespeare, the English playwright and poet. And when he died, he left his second best bed to his wife. It always begs the question, where did his first best bed go? But what I really love about it is that it illustrates that estate planning is intended for you to say whatever you want. There's no judgment. Sort of like Paul mentioned, whatever you want in terms of your end of life care, your medical plans, those are your wishes and should be honored. And what Paul and I both do is help you nail that down so that you know what you want and communicate that to your family and also to your physicians. We're going to focus really on medical directives. So there's 3 legal documents that comprise medical directives. A medical power of attorney, a living will, and a HIPAA authorization. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. And it's important to think about what your wishes are as you think about these documents. My husband's also a lawyer. He's a great Jewish man from Long Island. And he jokes a lot with his parents, with whom he's very close, that old people don't get choices. We don't say that to be offensive. He might, but I don't. But what it goes to mean is when I did my in-laws' estate plans, he was not their first choice agent because they were worried that he would not necessarily make the choices they want. As Paul said on his last slide, when you're making medical directives, they should be your wishes and not the wishes of your surviving family members. A medical power of attorney. So a medical power of attorney is the legal document that allows you to appoint an agent to act on your behalf in the event of a medical emergency. So this could be anything from, as Paul said, end of life, just you are aging and you need someone to help you make medical choices. Or it could be before then, which is the true, car accident medical emergency. I know a lot of my young family clients, that's their worry. What would happen to them if they were both in an accident? So we plan for both events. And the medical power of attorney often says that your agent, the person you've chosen, is supposed to act according to any of your preferences, what they believe you would want done under the circumstances, and information given to them by your treating physician. So if you have known wishes, religious, moral, social, cultural, lifetime movie, or ghost hunters based, there's no judgment, it's important that you convey those. Some of my clients would never be organ donors, would never get a vaccine, never want organs removed. These are important things for you to think about in your life and communicate them to your family, either orally or through the legal document, which is the medical power of attorney. One of the things that I've been talking a lot with clients about recently is, what about the coronavirus? So if you go to the hospital in today's world, you're not taking guests with you. Family is not visiting. You're not leaving, going home to pack a bag and get your paperwork and going back. If you go because you're ill, you go and you stay. Hopefully you go and you eventually leave in better health. But so the important thing is, if you have medical directives, you need to take them with you when you go to see your doctor or you go to the emergency room in the first instance. So what I mean in real world terms is you're literally keeping a copy in your car or in your purse so that it is always with you. If you have them on your phone, on a Dropbox or a cloud or in your email, that is also okay, as long as you're taking your phone with you and you can share them with your medical provider if necessary. For some of my clients who they help their parents, I give them the same advice, right? So if your daughter or your son or your medical power of attorney, they need copies of your medical directives also. And if they're providing ongoing care, they need to carry those around with them, right? I think it's the document you're shopping around. I always have it with me. It goes in my purse and it's there just in case. The other thing that you can do is you can register your documents with the Arizona Secretary of State. I don't really recommend this for younger people who might change their mind, but if you feel very firm about your choice in your agents and you're not going to change your mind, you can send them in to be recorded with the Secretary of State. They send you back a little card that you put in your wallet, and then medical professionals can access those documents if needed in the event of an emergency and you don't have them with you. The living will. So the medical power of attorney is a longer document. The living will covers your life, as great as it is, but is actually a really short document. So it's putting together all of your thoughts in just a few words. So what it says is that if you have a terminal illness, an incurable condition, or you have live only in a vegetative state, then you do not want prolonged life support or life-sustaining treatment. Often my clients say, yes, they want drugs, right? We want pain relief, but we don't want ongoing life support. And then it's up to you to think about what that means. How do you feel about artificial hydration and nourishment? For some people, that's pain relief, and that would be important to them. For others, that's merely extending the life more than they would like. So you would make that choice in advance. The living will serves a couple of purposes. One is you are making the choice on what you think about life support, and you're not leaving that choice up to your surviving family members. So you are alleviating them from the burden of having to make that choice because you've already expressed your intentions and your wishes. The other thing that I talk about with my clients in a living will is, do you want more time? So again, there's no judgment at the office. My clients have said, we want to wait for a full lunar cycle to pass before we're taking off life support. Their opinion is that has some connection to body rhythms and chemistry. Do you want to wait for family who are out of the country or live far away to come and see you? Do you want to wait for some end of life ritual? So for your rabbi or another person to come and see you. Do you want to wait for a life event, right? Are you hanging on solely for the birth of a family member or for a wedding? We can build the living will to say whatever it is that you want, but again, it's an expression of your intentions. In today's time, in the time of the coronavirus, I'm also talking to people about whether or not they want invasive medical treatment. So some people believe that the treatment for the coronavirus is invasive, and they think we would absolutely want no type of invasive medical treatment, even if it's for the coronavirus. We believe that would be painful, the recovery would be prolonged, and that's not our wish. And so I say that in the living will. Other clients, they want all possible medical care, right? This is what Paul talked about. They want everything done if they're sick for the coronavirus. And so I say the exception to the living will is the coronavirus. And it could be any other type of medical condition that you wish. But again, the point is that you're making that choice in your life and your family will honor it. And the last document I wanted to talk to you about is the HIPAA authorizations, right? So under federal law, you don't provide access for medical records to anyone who hasn't expressly been given permission, right? So your parents, your siblings, your children, even your spouse are not supposed to have access to your medical information absent authorization. Every time you go to the doctor, you've probably filled out the form where you write down your emergency contact and say if you do or do not give them permission. The HIPAA authorization says the same thing. You identify those people that you would give access to your medical information if you are unable to make your own medical decisions. So there's still a presumption there that you have a medical incapacity. And it can be as many people as you want, right? So all of your children, your spouse, your parents, your siblings, as many people as you want. But some people limit that, right? So Paul will probably say, do us a favor and don't name the annoying relative that's gonna call every day, right? So we wanna identify family members that will be communicative to other family members, right? Who is the hub of your family? And let them be able to talk to the doctor They're receiving information, not making choices or treatment choices. And then the hub of the family can communicate those wishes to other people. I see HIPAA authorizations really important under a couple of circumstances. The first is if your family lives out of town. So for example, my husband's grandfather lives in Florida. And when he went to the hospital, none of the immediate family also lives in Florida. So everybody was out of town. And so someone had to call the hospital to say, how bad is it? Should we be coming? What can you tell us? So HIPAA authorizations are important for people who live out of town who would need to understand the seriousness of your condition. They're also very important for single people, right? If no one would know you're at the emergency room but you, we need to put somebody on the list to have access to your information so that they can share that with other family members or friends or with your rabbi so that they can communicate that you're having a difficult time in your life. And the third category of people I work a lot on HIPAA authorizations is actually young adults, right? So kids over the age of 18, whether they're actually off the bankroll or not, are considered legal adults. And once they hit 18, you no longer, as a parent, have access to their information. So if you have single adult children, you would want to be on their HIPAA authorization in the same way you would want to be on theirs. And this applies to everybody from 18 to 98. As I said at the beginning, the thing about estate planning is that it's your wishes. So Fred Brower, he created Pringles, and his wish was that he be cremated and buried in a Pringles can. Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, and his wish was that his remains be launched into space, and they were in '97, and his wife's followed in 2009. So we didn't talk about funeral instructions, memorial instructions, or cremation versus burial, but that's something else to think about, which is, what do you want? It can seem completely eerie. I know no one's going anywhere now, but if you were to visit a funeral home and to pick out your service or to pick out your casket, I know that that can feel overwhelming, and some people are not prepared for that. On the other side of the coin, I recently lost two very close family members, and I can tell you, losing someone and then having to do something both as monumental and as trivial as trying to decide which casket they would like is really, really overwhelming for people who are also facing grief. So the more planning you can do, the more comfort you're giving yourself that your wishes will be honored, but also the comfort that you're providing to your family so that they will know what it is that you want. I didn't talk for 30 minutes. I'm happy to listen to your questions and your stories, and I know that Paul is as well, and we want to be helpful. So let us know what's on your mind, and hopefully we can spend the rest of the time talking about those types of things.
Can I, that was really excellent, Allison. Can I just make a couple comments?
Absolutely.
You know, the language in most of the traditional living wills, as you describe them, actually, unfortunately, are not really in sync with a lot of what actually happens. And, you know, as you described it, it says, you know, if I have a terminal illness or I'm going to be in a vegetative state, you know, I wouldn't want this. But that's not, those are not what usually are the circumstances we're dealing with. So let me just try and elaborate on that a little bit. Number one, you either have a sudden death experience where somebody calls 911 and potentially gets resuscitated. And then, you know, if something like that happens, you literally have 3 minutes to restore adequate circulation to the brain before there's irreversible brain damage. And you can't figure that out right away. So people come in, are brought into the hospital after they've been resuscitated, and they're on a ventilator, and their living will says, well, if I have a terminal illness or are going to be in a vegetative state, I wouldn't want this, but neither of those circumstances apply. So it's a little bit, well, what would you or wouldn't you want? The other common circumstance is somebody has chronic lung disease or heart failure and they get pneumonia and they're in respiratory failure and they might need to get put on the ventilator, or they get coronavirus and might need to be put on the ventilator, and they have a chance to recover for 3 to 5 days or a week on the ventilator with antibiotics or whatever. And people, a lot of the times, what I hear people say, well, yeah, I'm willing to have resuscitation attempted, or I'm willing to be on the ventilator or on life support for a short period of time. But if the prognosis isn't good after that, I wouldn't want it to be extended indefinitely. So the degree to which you can customize these living will statements is great, because most people, it's hard to say when you're you're lucid and you feel like your quality of life is pretty good. You say, well, what would you want if? You're going to say, well, I don't know. It depends on what my circumstances are. So you can leave a little flexibility, and these things are not locked in stone where once you do it, they're there in perpetuity. So you can modify these as you go along. Now that brings up the question that Carol said, was a living will take precedence over a medical power of attorney? The answer to that is, the only time a medical power of attorney is called upon to make decisions is if the patient lacks the capacity to do it. So if you come into the hospital and you're lucid and aware and you express your wishes, the medical power of attorney is a moot point. Now, unfortunately, when you're acutely ill, or obviously if you're put on a ventilator or something, you may lack that capacity. So then they're going to turn to the medical power of attorney. But if there's an existing living will, that MPOA can't override it. I mean, if it says, I want everything done, and medical power of attorney says, nah, I'm sick of this guy, let's bump him off. You can't, the MPOA can't override that. So, that's why it's good to have that living will with as much detail, and or tell your MPOA what you mean by, well, if the prognosis is poor, I wouldn't want to go on. Well, what is prognosis poor means different things to different people. If it means I can't walk again or talk again, or I'll be in a nursing home for the rest of my life, or I won't recognize my family when they come to visit, whatever it is, you can specify that. And then I'll let you answer, and then getting your other question, Carol, about what happens if the first responders show up. Well, unless there's an explicit documentation in the house that says do not use resuscitation or heroic measures or life-sustaining treatment, they're going to do those things that they deem necessary. But if you have made a determination that you wouldn't want that, there are forms it's actually an orange form printed on an orange piece of paper that you could display prominently in the refrigerator or somewhere, they would honor that if it says he would not want resuscitation. But otherwise, they're gonna act to do everything to resuscitate people and take them to the hospital.
Thank you, Paul. Allison, is there anything you want to add to any of that?
Oh, sure, I was going to type a message. So to Paul's first point, I ask my clients, do you want the living will to take precedence over your healthcare power of attorney? So that's a choice you would make in advance on which one supersedes the other in terms of hierarchy. And so you would decide that, Carol, I know this was your question, as part of your choices. The other thing I was going to say is, before stainless steel appliances, not everybody, but people who wanted had like an orange magnet that they put on their refrigerator that said do not resuscitate, if that was their choice. We don't really have those anymore. I think I have magnets on my dishwasher, which wouldn't really be helpful. But otherwise, your spouse or someone in the home with you would say, Carol has a DNR, and then the staff on site would make the choice at the time whether to honor it or not.
Thank you, Allison. Anybody else have a question that you want to pose either to Paul or to Allison?
You can unmute yourself by pressing the unmute, and you can ask a question of our panelists. or we can put your hand up and we'll unmute you.
Go ahead, Barbara. Mel.
This is a question for Paul Stander. What if a patient has a very poor prognosis and has an untreatable disease, but the family demands that everything be done? What's the obligation of the doctor?
Okay, it's a good question, Mel. By the way, good to see you guys. Hope you're doing well. Glad to see you. So it's a complicated question and a complicated process. So first of all, if the person has a living will where they've expressed a certain wish, and just the family wants to override it, then we won't necessarily oblige by that, because again, it's what did the patient want? It's not what the family wants. Now, if there's no previous living will or any determination and the family is insisting on things, it gets, and the prognosis is really, really poor. I mean, we've had circumstances like that I've lived through many times. So physicians are not obligated to provide care that they deem to be non-beneficial or harmful. So you're not obliged to, intubate somebody or keep somebody on a ventilator or do a dialysis if somebody's, got metastatic cancer and it's not going to survive, it has a horrible prognosis. Having said that, most doctors and hospital systems and things get really reluctant to not follow the wishes of family because they're afraid they could get sued and things like that. The precedence over that is most courts have upheld physicians, but in general, it's mostly, when families or patients are insisting on what is considered really quote unquote futile care or non-beneficial care, most of the time it's an ongoing dialogue. And as you'll provide the care for a while, as they see things aren't getting better, patients could be, really in pain or suffering or, bucking the ventilator, whatever it might be. Usually people come around, but in other countries, more often than not, physicians will override that or make that decision. And interestingly, during the pandemic here, when things were really in crisis mode, and that's what it was called, the governor really authorized hospitals and physicians to, make those decisions and theoretically allocate or not use ventilators on people who the prognosis would be very poor based on underlying conditions or age or whatever. It really, I don't think, came to that. We didn't have to we had contingency plans for that at the VA. And I know at Banner, I still work on the ethics committee at Banner. And there were actually statewide plans made for that, it's when you have limited resources. But it never came to that. But those situations are not pretty, and it's better that's why having these discussions in advance to prepare for those contingencies are better, or planning them with a state lawyer like Allison, where you can have some of these, at least begin that conversation and discussion is better.
Thanks for that question, Mel. Anybody else have a question for either Paul or Allison? And remember, you have to unmute yourself.
Or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself.
Or wave your hand.
And we'll unmute you.
I wonder how many people out there have an advance directive, a living will, have appointed a medical power of attorney? I can only see Carol saying yes, but
I think it's everybody.
Wow.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, we have a skewed audience, then obviously people who are interested in listening on this probably have already, it's kind of like preaching to the choir. The people who need to be hearing this aren't tuning in. But, it's good. Hopefully, you got some more insight.
Barbara,
My question is how soon can people be taken into hospice? In other words, how long can they actually stay, or can you keep them there? Hi, Paul.
Hey, Barb. So hospice, remember, is a service and a philosophy and a Medicare, benefit. So it's well defined that to be eligible for hospice, you have to have a prognosis of survival of 6 months or less. Now that's nebulous, and a physician has to determine it. And as I told you, it's an inexact science. It doesn't mean that you have exactly 6 months, and as soon as you reach that period, you're off hospice. So you theoretically can be on hospice for up to 9, 12, 18, 2 years. And you see that in very extreme circumstances. Medicare, who's the primary payer for hospice, scrutinizes that and looks at Medicare hospice agencies and looks at their percentage of patients who are on over 6 months. And if it's more than about 10%, that agency usually comes under scrutiny and intense Medicare review, which none of those agencies want. And also the reimbursement diminishes after 6 months. So it's sort of a disincentive to enroll people prematurely. But in honesty, there's a lot of times where you just think somebody's got 6 months or less. They come on hospice. Sometimes you take them off some of their meds. They're not running back and forth to the hospital. The nurses are coming out, and they actually improve a little, and they will survive longer. And sometimes, you can enroll, disenroll, re-enroll. So there's no, so I hope that answers the question. There's no exact ticking time clock, but, the further beyond 6 months you go, the more scrutiny you're going to come under.
Mel? Oh, wait, Mel, hang on a second. Eileen, I saw your hand first. Eileen.
Oh, okay. Well, Paul, are there alternatives to hospice
Are
for
there?
those who don't prefer it?
Well, of course. I mean, nobody, hospice is an enrollment. You have to agree and consent. And it just depends on, as I said, it's only a consideration. It should be a consideration for people who have 6 months or less if they choose to avail themselves of those services, which is nursing visits and a focus on symptom management rather than treatment of the underlying disease. So nobody forces anybody to do it. So it's I'm not quite sure if that's answering your question or what you meant by it, but that's kind of the way I approach it.
Eileen?
Well, you may approach it differently, but the bottom line is this. When my mother was finally diagnosed with terminal cancer, as opposed to getting all the treatment and doing quite well, at the hospital, they didn't give us a choice. They immediately said she needs palliative care and she qualifies for hospice, so she's going to get hospice. And, I'm a lawyer. So they didn't like me at all because I don't want to hear that. And she didn't want to hear it either. We ended up with hospice, and that's the way life and death are. But the point is that I don't want it. I'd rather walk in front of a bus. So as a result, I just want to know what kind of alternatives there are, because it's nothing I want.
Well, I don't know, exactly what your impression of hospice is or not, but let's separate and apart from that. You know, you can't be put into or enroll in hospice without signing an agreement. So I'm not saying that hospitals, a lot of the times hospitals are looking to discharge patients who they feel like they can't effectively treat, or they don't think they have anything to offer. And hospice can be a process by which they can do that. So they can sort of push people in that direction. But if you say, no, I don't want to enroll in hospice, you don't have to. Now you can but then you need to figure out what your alternative is. Take them home and get home nursing care, put them in a nursing home. I don't know what you mean by alternatives. Generally speaking, if somebody at the hospital feels they're a hospice candidate, they generally need a fair amount of care. So most people feel more favorable towards hospice than you do when the circumstances warrant it. But otherwise, it's all depends on how much care the patient needs and what the alternatives might be.
Allison, did you want to respond to a piece of that?
I guess I was happy to say, I think for Eileen, I think the choice is at-home care. You have to be able to afford your own care.
Exactly.
Right. So if that's your plan,
Medicare will cover certain home care services, but it's pretty limited, and that's unfortunately the status of our healthcare system now. There's not great insurance coverage for home care services. If you can afford it, sure, you can get whatever you want, but most people can't because it gets very expensive.
Beth, you had a question? And then Michael? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I put it in the chat. Allison, how often should you review your medical documents, that you've put into place, for issues that come up?
So a lot of review happens with a life event. People have entered your family, people have departed from your family, you have a new relationship, at the end of a relationship, or you've received a diagnosis. Those types of things often prompt review. I'm interested in Paul's opinion on this, but I often talk to people about getting new signed documents every 2 to 3 years, even if your choices are the same. But what I see is that providers want to have documents dated that express your current intentions and not your intentions from a decade ago, for example.
Yeah, I think that in general, I totally agree with what you said. I mean, if it's from 10 years ago, we're not going to ignore them, but generally speaking, the more recent they are, the better. And certainly any of the life events Allison described, and again, from the medical standpoint, I mean, if you have a new diagnosis that's significantly going to change your life expectancy or your ultimate prognosis, you may want to change what your wishes were previously. So I don't think there's a rule of thumb. I like Allison's notion of every 3 years or so, at least doctors aren't going to likely question that. Those are pretty recent, but it's not mandatory.
Thank you both for answering that question. Michael, and then Mel, and then Jeffrey.
Right.
Michael, you have to unmute yourself.
There we go. We have used a service called DocuBank, which contains our living wills. Is that something that you recommend?
Yes, absolutely, that works. Just some way to be able to access the documents in the event of an emergency. That is a good provider.
Allison, will you explain what that is so everybody knows?
Sure. So I mentioned in my presentation that a Secretary of State has a healthcare registry. There's also a private service, a company called DocuBank, where you can store your medical records for a fee, and then you're always able to access them, sort of through your client portal if there's an emergency, and you can grant other people, so family members, for example, access if you want as well.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Michael. Mel?
Paul,
Yeah.
would you clarify for your audience the difference between palliative care and hospice?
Okay, good, sure. So palliative, the word palliative means to symptom relief, to provide comfort. It is prognosis independent, meaning virtually every physician provides palliative care in one way or another. I mean, providing pain relief. If you were a young person in had a big traumatic injury with chronic pain or severe pain, you might get a palliative medicine specialist to help with pain management. So palliative medicine is a broad term that is prognosis independent, that can be applied at any stage of an illness, often in conjunction with curative or treatment of the underlying illness. Hospice is specifically palliative medicine or palliative care in its purest form, where again, it's a service and a philosophy as well as a Medicare insurance benefit for people where the treatment of the underlying disease is generally considered no longer very effective or feasible. So somebody who's got widely metastatic cancer despite treatment with chemo and radiation and whatnot, and now are in a lot of pain, and there's no more effective underlying treatment, that's typically a candidate for hospice. And again, it's prognosis dependent, that generally speaking, it's 6 months or less. That's somewhat of an unfortunate thing, and that was a Medicare determination really on a cost basis, because there are experimental models out there, and even Medicare is doing that, where you're allowed to have hospice concurrently with treatment of the underlying illness, and we do that in the VA. So for instance, you have an advanced cancer, but there are some chemo or radiation available, and people want to opt for that, but they also know those things are going to have a lot of side effects. So you have a hospice that in conjunction, and you have a nurse who can come and visit while you're getting your treatments. That's the best of both worlds. That would be the model if I had my druthers that I would put in place. And Medicare is looking at it. Actually, most of the studies have shown that while the upfront costs are a little higher, the long run costs are less, because people do better for a while, but as they then, no longer have effective treatment, they're more likely to opt out of going into the ICU or back to the hospital ad infinitum. So I hope that clarifies, clears up the differences.
Thank you. Question, Mel. Jeff.
Yeah, so let's make this a hypothetical question, but I think it might in some ways relate to what Eileen was asking, maybe not. Let's say that I've been diagnosed as being terminally ill, 6 months or less. I do not want to go into hospice. I know I'm going to be in great pain. I want to have a prescription from my physician that provides me with sufficient pain medication to make my own decisions about my own palliative care. Does that option exist in Arizona?
So, okay. First of all, let me just address, the notion of terminal illness is a very nebulous term. Life is a terminal illness, right? Or people with heart failure or chronic lung disease, these are not curable. So for all intents and purposes, you could look at them as a terminal illness. But if you want to define it as somebody whose life expectancy or prognosis is 6 months or less, and when you say they don't want to go into hospice, that means they still want treatment of their underlying condition to some degree, one way, shape, or form, which is fine. But they want to assure that they also are getting adequate symptom management and pain management. So in the past, or let's take the oncology world, the cancer doctors would be responsible for providing some of those pain meds. There's nothing that prevents any of your primary care doctor from prescribing oxycodone or morphine or Dilaudid, whatever med they might deem. The reality is most docs aren't very good at it. With the opioid crisis, there's been a lot of pressure on doctors not to use these drugs. And so sadly, there shouldn't be obstacles, but there are. What most palliative care programs that are out there are hospital-based, and which means they do consults and take care of patients while they're in the hospital. The outpatient palliative care services that are available that are short of hospice, frankly, are unfortunately very limited. They're mostly affiliated with cancer programs. And then, so there you'll have your oncologist who might be still offering you some palliative chemo or radiation, but have an associate who's going to take care of your pain management. And there are anesthesiologists and anesthesia programs where they can do injections or, actually implant devices sometimes for really refractory severe pain that, spinal cord stimulators and other devices that block pain. So the answer to your question is yes, there are services available. Unfortunately, they're not as widely available as they could or should be. And as I said, most doctors, aren't really very facile or comfortable with using opioids, and they tend to underdose and not really treat the side effects. And, that's part of the special training you get in palliative medicine. So.
Thank you, Jeff, for the question, and Paul for your response. Fred, you had your hand up, and I remember also the other day you had some questions during schmooze, but I can't remember.
Well, here's one. Let me answer. Rebecca put up a question there, and I think it's really an important point when she says going into hospice. Hospice is not a place,
right?
Okay. The vast majority, 90+% of hospice patients are at home, and it's designed to keep people at home for as long as possible. It's only limited circumstances where people might go to a hospice facility, and the two circumstances tend to be when there's some symptom that's out of control, pain, nausea, vomiting, delirium, a wound that demands services or requires services that are beyond what can be delivered at home, or the very final stages where people are within hours to days of death. Right. Other than that, everybody is at home. So going into hospice means, turning your care over to a hospice agency, and generally no longer, pursuing treatment of your underlying conditions in a big way. I mean, you can still be on inhaler meds or diabetes meds or blood pressure meds, but in general, you're not going to be going back to the hospital if you have an exacerbation or having procedures and things done, unless you sign off hospice. And because it's a financial thing. I mean, the hospice agencies are getting paid a flat per diem fee. That's when you're at home, it's about $175 a day. If you're in the facility, it's about $575. But if you want to get chemo while you're on hospice, the one drug is about several $1,000s. It's not viable for an agency to pay for that service. So that's a good point, Rebecca, that you made, that it's really a home hospice.
Thanks. It's 8 o'clock. I want to leave, if everybody's okay, just a few more minutes for Fred to get into the question.
Well, that's right. I just wonder, when you're on hospice, can you continue to use your own doctors? Good question.
Yeah. So if you enroll in hospice and you want to keep your primary care doctor, the answer, you can. It's unlikely that, you're going to want to, or you're going to be able to go still see a cardiologist or oncologist or whatever, because again, that's not really conducive with the hospice philosophy of care. But if your primary care doctor is willing and wants to remain with you, fine. again, you want to make sure that he or she knows what they're doing in terms of how to prescribe. And sometimes, you'll find that they're not as readily available on call for things that happen. So you can always have the hospice physicians available as backup for like weekends or nights when your own doctor. But yeah, the hospice agencies are required to allow you to maintain your own doctor if you want and they're willing.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Fred. What? Allison or Paul, any last quick comments since we're a little bit over time? Allison?
I was going to add just briefly to one of the questions from before, and Paul can't tell you this, so Paul's going to turn off his ears. But if you came to me because you were ill and you did not want care and you could afford it, I would tell you to visit one of our neighboring countries and to go to a pharmacy and to call me when you get back.
Well, it's not, you don't necessarily have to go to another country. There's a few states. What she's talking about is, medical aid in dying. It's a controversial subject.
Wow, look what time it is, everybody. This is great. I'm so
yeah, and I'm not a huge proponent, to be honest with you, other than I don't think it's an unreasonable option in limited circumstances. And the way the rules have been written, it's such that all the laws of where it does exist in this country, in like Oregon and California, a few other places, the patient has to be able to self-administer the medication at the time of their choosing. It's not what you might expect that you go somewhere and somebody gives you a shot and poof. It's not euthanasia. So it's a controversial subject. I don't think, we want to get into it too much.
It's a subject for another day.
Yeah. So.
Carol, that was my question from Schmooze. That was exactly my question from Schmooze.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad it got in.
And I would just say this, it should be a very rare circumstance because, it's for people who, no matter under the best of all possible palliative care hospice circumstances, they're still in severe pain or some other refractory symptom. It's pretty unusual. There is a sort of a middle ground, something called palliative sedation, where we can basically induce a coma, where people are using a barbiturate or something, where they're unconscious and no longer suffering and feeling, pain, but then, and they'll die slowly, but not in pain, where you don't have to administer some lethal dose. So I've been involved in that on rare circumstances. Again, we get an ethics consult and we make sure the family fully understands and are on board. But we could have another whole nother ethics discussion at some point if you want.
So to Paul and Allison, thank you for giving us your time tonight. Rabbi, thank you for finding Allison and Paul for us. My apologies when I suggested this date to Rabbi. I didn't think about the Republican convention being this week. So for those of you
who didn't miss anything, by that.
Hey, excellent.
I know, but
I hope for those of you who were interested in the convention that you're recording it, but my apologies to you and anybody else who didn't get on the call because of the double schedule. Rabbi, back to you.
Thank you all, everyone. I'm glad that you had a chance to know with us for an extended version. We usually go an hour, but tonight we went an hour and a half for 2 speakers, 2 for the price of 1. Allison, thank you. Paul, thank you. If I don't see you before, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. And Shana Tova in 3 weeks. Whoa. Woo. 3 weeks.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be well.
You too.